for coming today, and I'm particularly thrilled to have Sudipta Sen as our speaker. I know some of you know his work extremely well, and for those of you who don't, I would strongly recommend reading his many books and essays. He's a remarkably erudite scholar, pretty deep reading in numerous fields, and in many ways I think he's one of the scholars of South Asian studies who has managed to create this extraordinary interdisciplinary body of work. Sudipta is a professor of history, and he's also the director of the Middle East South Asia Studies program. So I gather it's a combined program, and good luck running something that is probably very taxing on you.
Yes.
And this is at University of California at Davis. So, Sudipta is a historian of late Mughal and early British India and the British Empire. He graduated from Presidency College, Calcutta, and later went to the University of Chicago for his PhD in history, which he got with distinction. He has taught at numerous institutions, and in fact, Syracuse was one of the places where Sudipta was for a long time, and I met him there when he was teaching. He's had numerous awards and grants. His work has largely focused on the early history of British expansion in India. He is the author of The Empire of Free Trade, the English East India Company and the Making of the Colonial Marketplace, which was published in 1998, and Distant Sovereignty, National Imperialism and the Origins of British India, that was published in 2002. And his latest book, which is called The Ganges, The Many Paths of an Indian River, which just came out earlier this year, is an exploration of the idea of a cosmic, universal river at the interstices of myth, historical geography, and ecology. I mean, this is really an extraordinary book. It's magisterial in its scope. It's an astonishing feat of historical scholarship, combined with a vivid flair for storytelling. At times, Sudipta's descriptions of the river's mighty power have the feel of epic writing, in which the river is as much a character as the human beings that have stood in worship before it on the one hand, or exploited its resources on the other. In this book, there are biographies within histories and histories within myths, and material practices within the symbolic repertoire that tell a story much bigger than the Ganga itself. Sudipta highlights the stories of those who have not entered into the annals of Indian history, such as the boaters, the fishers, and agricultural cultivators. And in that sense, it's a contribution to subaltern history as much as it is to the sweep and scale of the river and its associated history.
And pilgrims.
And pilgrims, of course. You know, his opening chapter on pilgrims is really very detailed and very minute analysis of the whole process of pilgrimage in India. Indeed, what Sudipta evokes with such startling acumen is the nature of cultural memory itself, stitched from the mythic, historical, and ecological contours of Indian life. Sudipta thinks through the history and culture of the Indian subcontinent through the frame of the Ganga in such a way as to suggest that what he calls a uniquely Indian consciousness extends into modes of experiencing the river, and this is where the notion of pilgrimage is so important. The river's ritual significance coexists with intimate forms of knowledge of nature, and how nature bears on the ways that society organizes itself. from tribes to empires. And one of the things that really moved me so much in this book is the way that Sudipta is able to talk about both the sacred and the material without privileging one over the other, which is sometimes a pitfall in studies of something as important as the role of rivers in a society's culture. And I think the way in which Sudipta is able to talk about the sacred without downplaying the material, and conversely talking about material practices without ever losing sight of the sacred power of the river. To me, that was really one of the great achievements of this book. So thank you so much, Sudipta. You're going to speak today about Ganga as imperial icon.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Lori. Thank you. Thanks for coming, everybody, and thank you for this wonderful and such a kind and generous introduction. I have my iPad here, I think, and I thought that I should show you at least the cover of the book so you can judge it.
But I'm sorry, I forgot to bring mine because it was too heavy.
No, it's okay. Don't worry about it. I think I can do that. And there it is. I think you can just, if you want to pass it, just in case you feel like it's a good gift for weddings, bar mitzvahs, funerals. Works very well for funerals.
You miss New Year's.
Yes. Why not? Why not?
Sacred now.
That's it. Or opening of a shop, yeah, if it just goes off, just tap it. So I did not want to talk about the book. The book is out now also in India under a slightly different name with Penguin Viking called Ganga, the Many Paths of a River, because in India the Indian river doesn't quite, it's too much. And there's so many opinions about the book that I'm quite overwhelmed already. I have a lurking suspicion that many people writing about it are not actually reading it, which is maybe a blessing. We'll see. So what I want to do today is to talk something from the book, for maybe perhaps thinking about a slightly different project, but something which was very much part of the process of writing this book, which by the way took about 15 years. I don't recommend it for anybody, but that included one accident and things like that, and but it is a 2,000-year history, and it took its toll. My beard was actually a little bit less white when I started. I won't call the process discovery, as you will say, because what I have to say today is not really anything new that you don't know, but rather a personal odyssey through these many hundreds of years of Indian history, and focusing, among other things, the emergence of the Ganges Valley as what I've called in some ways the Indian version of Chumquo, or like a middle kingdom in a sense. And this I discovered from the earlier work, scholars knew it, goes back to the age of early Buddhism, and even a little further back, sort of transition between the western part of the Vedic presence to the reclamation of the lower part of the Gangetic Valley, ultimately with the rise of the city-states and Magadha. This middle country then serves as a political and symbolic landscape which is fought over across centuries, but not only by northern Indian regimes, but many regimes from the south, including the Pallavas, the Chalukyas, the Rashtrakutas, and the Cholas, along with the Gurjara Pratyaharas, the Palas, and before them, many dynasties, and all the way down to the early Ghurids versus the Gahadawalas, and what I was witnessing is erection, destruction, sacking, looting of cities, markets, fortresses for thousands of years. So this, in some ways, today, my talk is about a history of spolia and spoliation, and I have shamelessly borrowed from the art historians, and I'm going to try to walk you through some of these ideas of what does spolia mean, both in a constructive and a destructive sense, and maybe that, to me, gives me some purchase on a way of remembering the ghosts of regimes and objects in history's past that are enfolded into the life stories of different imperial and kingly formations. And whenever we go through those formations, we recapitulate a history which has to do also with the 19th century. And it's the history of the British discovery of the conquerors before them that is also written into, in some ways, right, into the way Indian history has been framed. How we get out of this is not necessarily my problematic today. Mine is to sort of recognize how, in some ways, these layers are put together. And there are people who have worked on this here, so I would look for any help. This is a very early project. So those of us at Chicago who had the privilege to work with Professor Ronald Linden, we were introduced to the history of spolia and spoliation from, at that time, I'm not sure we understood what he was getting at, but I think I'm giving him not even a backhanded, a serious compliment here. So in this talk, I want to revisit the long, embattled and discriminatory history of the passing of regimes, the transmission of objects and artifacts and structures. I want to reflect on the very idea of conquest and the assimilation of defeated or politically humbled entities, such as tribes, kingdoms, and empires. And I want to ask, in what ways do past institutions, practices, customs, forms of religious belief, etc. persist or manifest their presence within the depths of regimes who have a selective amnesia and also remembrance of such pasts. I'd like to briefly discuss also how perceived stretches of time, and I use the word duration here rather than historical time. These are slightly different things. It's a Bergsonian difference. How those durations are enfolded and nested within the temporal frames, the time frames of the architectures of conquest that are so visible, that are so many, and for many of us from school textbooks are such mnemonics of Indian history, the visual, almost a visual, like a braille almost, if you like, even, of Indian history. And which also seem to bear, in some ways, or carry with them the ghosts of objects past and of past regimes. Historians of Renaissance and Islamic art and architecture have grappled with these very questions much longer than the historians of Indian antiquity. And I invoke today the work of historians, a few, and there are many others, and I'm sure I'm leaving out a lot of people, but the ones that I have actually found very useful in my study, especially the people who study the history of temple breaking or temple dismantling and the spoliation of images and objects, such as Richard Davis, or the history of early Turkish and Afghan dynasties in India. This early work was done by Richard Eaton, and more recently, the history and representation of Islamic architecture and art in Sultanate and post-Sultanate India by Barry Sinbar Flood and my colleague at UC Irvine, Alka Patel, and there are many, many others here. Very briefly then, and here art historians can forgive me, historians of spolia wrestle with the following questions. How are figures, emblems, buildings, structures, and architectural spaces assimilated, incorporated, reused, memorialized, or repatriated by the incoming regime, especially after a period of war and conquest? What are the terms of such reuse? Is it simply for the purpose of exploiting material from buildings destroyed or dismantles, pillars, domes, lintels, murals, inscriptions, maybe texts? Or is such appropriation a deeper reflection of the desire to consume, subsume, and rehabilitate the aesthetic and visceral presence of the regimes displaced, and thus, in many ways, a serious acknowledgement of its gravitas, of its charisma? Is it a apotropic gesture, evil eye, Kanahara, Chashme Badur, to ward off the malevolence and the curse of the vanquished or the slain? Is architectural borrowing a prophylactic measure, like the circulation of the Sphinx image in ancient Greece? Do fallen pillars and defaced buildings and the dismantling and reclamation of earlier structures involve a magical transubstantiation of their potency? Or is it a selective act of despoliation, as in the stripping away of fragments of buildings and structures and then displayed either as kingly or imperial collection or personal trophy? Architectural historians such as Richard Boulier, not Boulier, it's a different person, Richard Brilliant, makes a distinction between spolia in se and spolia in re, the taking of material objects and the taking of virtual entities. Spolia in re might include, for instance, the appropriation of books and libraries and texts, formulae, charms, incantations, forms of knowledge, and forms of decoding and translation. My emphasis here is not so much on the seizure of text and objects. However, I want to emphasize as I said earlier, the presence, resilience, resumption of the past. Not just antiquity, but certain modes of history and certain visceral modes of time and temporality that I believe are at the heart of this lingering spectral quality of spolia as residue. Now, the sacking and looting of cities are in school textbooks all over the histories of India. What exactly happened, we often are not led to know beyond the rapine, the murder, the arson, and enslavement of people. Why were some cities and capitals a target of looting and others not? And the forms of spolia were, we know, clearly heralds of conquest and glory. The capture of flags, the capture of rivers. Dhruva Dharavarsha of the Rashtrakutas, the Rajendra Chola, who washed their war elephants in the holy waters of the Ganges, or captured and brought the votive waters of the river to their respective capitals in triumph. The Rashtrakutas built the whole temple of Kailasha, recreated the northern realms in the south, in Elachalapuram, or Ellora. One of the most common aspects of spoliation in ancient India was the desecration and destruction of temples, and the looting and recycling of images and the display of such trophies of war in the temples and the battlements of the conquering regimes. Sometimes particular cities became the overwhelming object of despoliation, such as Varanasi or Kannauj. And I'm going to say a few things about this in a second. I just want to take a little bit of time and think about ways in which we can try to situate the history of looting and desecration into a larger history of incorporation. These are the Delhi Topra Ashokan pillars that Firoz Shah Tughlaq, the last great Tughlaq ruler, had brought over land in caravans and then in barges across the Yamuna and installed it in the middle of his as triumphal pillar. And this is the Firoz Shah Kotla. I'm sure you've seen it, many of you, near the cricket grounds. And then no, I'm just going to keep that. There's another one, of course, the Ashokan pillar, which is there in Allahabad, which has so many insignia built onto it. And this is something that I'm going to come back to. I just wanted to start with this image. Let's see how much time I have. I've always wanted to give a talk on just two pillars, but maybe this is not that one. Let me go back to, of course, let's say the 8th and the 9th centuries. I'll come back to this in a second. Why were cities like Varanasi, and especially Kannauj, the most invaded cities in India? I found out that Kannauj was the most invaded city of all times. The most ravaged, the most despoiled. One of the reasons why maybe the ruins of the old city are sparse and the Indian Archaeological Survey is still digging, perhaps. Now, a list of the notable invaders of Kannauj and their origins over centuries shows a remarkable succession of marches and protracted sieges, and by implication, the number of times the city was deserted, depopulated, and rebuilt. So I'm going to show you a quick list, which is in my book. These are at least the 13 great sieges of Kannauj. It starts with the ambassador Wang Chuanzhe, who intervened at the end of Harsha's reign. From Kashmir, Lalitaditya, Vatsaraja, Dhruva, they're marching their elephants through Kannauj, destroying temples, the buildings, the palas from Bengal. So it's just a long list. Rashtrakutas, Gurjar, Pratiharas, Rashtrakutas again on Indra III, Chandelas. And then, of course, you come to Muhammad al-Ghazni. Then followed by Chandradeva, the Garhwala, the guardian of Benares, and ultimately Qutbuddin Aibak. It is incredible to me sometimes how we draw a line with Ghazni and Aibak, right? And we don't often talk about, can we put Mahmud and Qutbuddin in the illustrious long list of people who have repeated similar feats? Now, they might not have broken images. That's a slightly different thing. Actually, they also did, but in different ways. So why this obsession with the city, Kannauj? Kannauj came into prominence as the ancestral stronghold of the Maukhari rulers, and Harsha made it the center of his sprawling empire, or the Harsha's dynasty came to an unexpected end after his death. The image of the imperial city on the Ganges had left a lasting impression on the Indian political imagination. The word Indian within quotes, I guess, that's okay, have to use it. Xuanzang, the Chinese pilgrim traveler, provides some of the most memorable descriptions of the city on the west bank of the Ganges, with its battlements, towers, and moats, along with lakes and lotus ponds shining like mirrors, abloom with flowers and lined with orchards of abundant fruit. Standing high on a cliff overlooking the passage of boats, pilgrims, and traders, and commanding the fertile plains of the upper Ganga, Yamuna, Doab, Kannauj enjoyed a strategic military advantage over every city in the rest of the valley, in Majjhima Desa, in Madhya Desha, in Middle Country. At the same time, the most plundered city. Not only because of its historical value as the old capital of the Maukharis and the Pushyabhutis, but because of its preeminent position, and because also of its most noticeable temples, most sacred and politically prominent. I wonder if Kannauj would have been more sacred than Varanasi if it had been allowed to continue. So the Kannauj triangle stories, you know, from school history textbooks, over centuries, regimes further afield in the south wanted to claim it and claim that space. Now, the repeated sacks of Kannauj raise a number of questions about the conventions governing pillage and distribution of the spoils of war that cannot be fully answered here. The history of spoliation and seizure of objects is still a relatively unexplored subject in Indian history, and we do not know how far back in time we can trace the desecration of temples and looting of idols and artifacts in acts of war. I found some of the most evocative passages on the looting and the building of Kannauj out of the loops of other cities during the time of Harshavardhana. And, you know, Bhanubhatta's Harshacharita is a fantastic text. I mean, you know, even if your Sanskrit is like mine, not that strong sometimes, sit down with a dictionary. It's just fantastic. So in Bana's account, we find a detailed description of the spoils of Rajyavardhana's last great victory in Malwa, before his murder being brought about by, by the enemy. Harshavardhana goes on this great conquest, right, to avenge his brother's death with his cousin Bhandi. But Bhandi is actually the person who leads the siege of Malwa and brings the loot of Malwa at the feet of the young Harsha, the prince's feet. And here's the way Bana describes the booty. The booty included the parts of the defeated king's army and equipage, numerous war elephants, great as moving boulders, prized war horses caparisoned and decked with ornaments, pearl necklaces snatched from the bosom of love-intoxicated Malwa women, royal white fly whisks made out of yak tails, the vanquished king's white umbrella with a golden stalk, female captives beautiful as celestial nymphs, lion-crested thrones of gold, and couches and stools, furniture. The victorious army also had seized the treasure chests of Malwa laden with, quote, wreaths and ornaments, along with detailed inventories of their contents. People were making lists. And these spoils of war were accompanied by a long line of retainers of the Malwa ruler captured alive. The retainers' feet were bound together in iron chains and brought before the young emperor. And this is the scenario that Bana campaigns. It is tempting to ask in what respects would someone like Mahmud of Ghazni's raid on the same city not be described in similar ways of spoliation. Of course, I'm forcing the issue here a little bit, but it's just something to think about. His characteristic poetic flamboyance notwithstanding, Bana provides a vivid and realistic account of the rich harvest of the Malwa campaign in circa 7th century CE. We can draw a parallel from the near contemporary Roman Empire, which had established a long and rich tradition of the display of objects seized in a war as a vital aspect of its exercise of power. Seizure, in fact, that's where spolia comes from. Seizure of such objects as talismans from the defeated was also symbolic appropriation of the strength of one's enemy, which is why weapons of fallen combatants were so prized by Roman patricians and plebeians alike. The sack of temples and the capture of idols is particularly noteworthy in the fierce Roman campaigns against the Greek islands of the Aegean, intending to strip the enemy of his divine protection. Graven images of conquered regimes ended up in the imperial treasury as well as in the private collection as cumulative inventories of past laurels. This is, of course, the spolia from the Temple of Jerusalem, famous one, the marble ark of Titus. You can see the artifacts, the furniture, the menorah, flutes. At times, such spolia also served to reaffirm the supreme virtues, the pietas, of the Roman gods and Roman ways of worship. The display of the public affirmation of trophies in the Temple of Jupiter and the adornment of patrician villas with shields, enemy standards, broken off beaks of vessels destroyed in naval combat suggests a penchant for the relics of worthy foes, especially those collected from distant and exotic frontiers of the Roman Empire. The Roman case is instructive in thinking about societies that were oriented towards routine aspects of warfare. Imagine the plunder pouring into the old capital during the siege of the Greek islands. Arms and armor from enemy chieftains slain in distant battlefields, idols seized from temples, agoras, and shrines to be reinstated in Roman shrines, and paintings, sculptures, and other objects of art. As Margaret Miles points out in an excellent book, the most sought-after prizes of war were the objects from personal collections, referred to as spolia in se, statues, paintings, figurines, vessels of precious metal, textiles, carved objects of wood or ivory, dedicated to sanctuaries and buildings. The capture of such objects by Romans in Sicily famously pricked the consciousness and the conscience of Cicero, who was very aghast at the wanton plunder of Praesacites as thievery punishable under Roman law. I have this similar image when I'm reading the stories of the East India Company and their great prize of Bengal. If you read Macaulay, sort of Clive walking, his halls bedecked with. The story of spolia never ends, right? There's no doubt that the triumphal display of spoliation was an integral part of warfare and dynastic rivalry. Richard Davis has drawn attention to the looting of cultural artifacts, especially temple idols, as a habitual feature of warfare in southern India. Pallavas supported the seizure of Pali Dhwaja, flags in rows, because they took flags from fallen combatants in the battlefield, assembled their pennants as a kind of a standard bearer of war. The Rashtrakuta imperial standard wielded an image of the eagle-winged Garuda, Vishnu's triumphal mascot, rising from the lotus. And Rashtrakuta standards branching from this central staff were pennants and emblems of conquered dynasties. The Nisarika grant of Govind III lists the insignias appropriated by the Rashtrakutas from 13 defeated kings, among them and their insignia. So just for curiosity's sake, fish of the Pandyas of Tamil country, the bulls of the Pallavas, the tigers of the Cholas, the elephants of the Gangas, the bows of the Keralas, of the Malabar, right? The Kerala Putras, the different kinds of boars of the Andhras, different boars. Chalukyas had their own wild boars and Vengi, and the Mauryas. Mauryas had a boar insignia in war. The later Mauryas, not the old ones. In their inventory were also captured objects and valuables from the legendary campaigns, doorkeeper carved on an oblong tablet used as a standard by the Gurjara Pratihara dynasty ruling in Kannauj. Figures were taken from Sri Lanka, Sinhala. Image of goddess Tara Bhagavati, seized from the King Dharmapala of Bengal, a replica of which might have also been used as a standard by the Palas in the battlefield. So in other words, spolia then also leads to the first museums, or rather the early museums of India, which were basically in the battlements of palaces of display of these objects. Now the question of spolia becomes exceptionally burdened in the context of what is still regarded as the period of Islamic conquest in India. I don't have to tell you this. I'm not going to go into the periodization and the characterization of this kind of conquest. But it is the period in which the history of spolia takes on a central stage in Indian history. And contentious as it may be, the selective reuse of buildings and building materials from Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist antiquity has become an essential part of this history. I would always say it's like the part of the DNA of Indian history in a kind of a deep sense. Just as the appropriation of Rome and Roman antiquities became key to the marking and the making of the Carolingian monuments in Europe. They bear witness to the role of architecture in absorbing bits and pieces of the material past, which, as Maria Hansen has pointed out, is an essential element of all forms of architectural spolia. Now, here I think there's a confusion. There's obviously a tendentious and mischievous, if I may use the word, conflation of spolia in re and spolia in se. In other words, the appropriation and the claim to antiquity then also becomes, in some ways, a form of desecration. Desecration is one kind of act. Appropriation is a slightly different kind of act. Can we separate them out a little bit? The first image I show you was a claim of appropriation. The recovery of the pillar, Firoz Shah Tughlaq bringing it into the fort, trying to decipher it. By the way, James Prinsep did the same thing, right? With the early Ashokan pillars. In this regard, structures like the Ark of Constantine in Rome and its layers and layers of recycled fragments of previous reliefs pose a fundamental challenge to the authenticity of historical objects, because they from different epochs and different dynasties, in a kind of pastiche or a montage, if you like. They remind us that fragments put together in different epochs have their own unique aura and significance. It says something more about the Carolingians rather than the authenticity of the regimes represented. And you can see the same things in the Ashokan pillars. The pillars bearing the edicts of Mauryan Emperor Ashoka, made out of sandstone, quarried near the Kaimur hills in Chunar, Mirzapur, eastern UP, chiseled and transferred to various sites during the 3rd century BC. And one of the most famous ones, the Allahabad pillar inscription, which not only bears Ashoka. Do I have a picture of this? I guess I don't have a picture of that. Never mind. Well, we'll just keep this for now. How do I get to full screen?
Go to slideshow.
Can I just touch the screen here now?
No, the mouse,
Oh, there's the mouse. Of course, yeah.
the mouse is right below you. There's a drawer that pulls out.
Yeah, I got it. Sorry about that. Yeah, thank you. The Allahabad pillar inscription not only bears Ashoka's message to his subjects, also the inscription of the 4th century Gupta imperial monarch, Samudragupta, and that's the great campaigns of Samudragupta, Harisena, and then 17th century Mughal Emperor Jahangir's inscription, and was reinstalled during Jahangir's father Akbar's reign from its original location to his great fort on the Ganges overlooking the confluence of Prayag, today Prayagraj. And you can imagine how the Gangetic landscape and spolia are part of the same tableau. Now both the Delhi Topra pillar that stands over the palace now in ruins, Firoz Shah Kotla, and the Delhi Meerut pillar inscriptions were transported by wheeled cars and barges along the Yamuna during the 15th century, as I said, by Sultan Firoz Shah Tughlaq of the Tughlaq dynasty. Such palimpsests of successive regimes is very much within the purview of spolia, But somehow the seriatim imperial remembrance of pillars do not seem to represent the kind of rupture that is the kind of the breaking that represented by the breaking of temples during the Sultanate period. In some ways, the story of Spolia in India has been dominated by a particular time frame, by a particular set of desecrations, and having to do with the early Ghurids and continuing through the later Sultanate, and maybe a little bit from the early Mughal period. But that is so much part of the story of the Islamic conquest, and I want to say something about that now. The Ghurids during the late 12th and early 13th centuries sought to establish an Islamic regime that included the building of congregational mosques, where the name of the ruler could be recited as a defender of faith during the Friday congregational prayer, the khutbah, which placed architecture at the center of manifest authority. There's no doubt about that. At least 5 Ghurid mosque complexes made out of brick, mosaic, and terracotta have been located across northern India, along with fragments of Hindu and Jain temples dating back to the 8th or 9th century CE. Many Ghurid era mosques now show the selective use of spolia, and here is the Atala Mosque. The Ajmer Mosque, which I don't have here, also known as the Adai Din Ka Jhopra, near the Dargah Khaja Moinuddin Chishti, the Shahi Masjid in the small township of Khattu, northwest of Ajmer, and the Chaurasi Khamba, or the 84 pillars in Mathura. These are all, this is Shahi Masjid, this is the Jami Masjid of the Atala Temple, and here's a pillar from the Chaurasi Khamba, or the Kaman Mosque. And of course the Qutub Minar. The Qutub Minar is one of my favorites, here's from the Qutub. I'm going to come back to an image from the Qutub before I end this talk. In none of these structures it is possible to tell with any degree of accuracy which original temple or monastery was singled out or eviscerated for the construction of courtyards or interiors, whether indeed some of these reused material came from structures that may have already stood in ruins during that time. However, smaller histories of architectural pillage and reassemblage have always been studied and understood within the overall context of a conquest story and the defeat and death of the valiant champion of Hindus, Prithviraj Chauhan. The legend of Prithviraj is so well known that it hardly warrants a repetition, but very quickly we can review how the defeat of Prithviraj and the martyrdom of the Gahadwala ruler Jayachand play into this story of the British retelling of the legend of this conquest, especially whose special interlocutor is the doyen of colonial storytellers, Colonel James Todd, if you remember Todd. So what's the story? Just to jog your memory, Shihabuddin Ghuri famously defeats the Chahamana ruler Prithviraj in a pitched encounter at the Second Battle of Tarai, 1193, ending an unusually concerted resistance from the various warring Rajput clans. Chand Baradai's famous epic, Prithviraj Raso, this has been studied very well by Cindy Talbot, and surviving Persian sources do not agree whether he was killed in battle or blinded or taken as captive to either Ajmer or Ghazni. The end of Prithviraj has been emblazoned in the annals of Indian history, partly because of the eloquent tribute paid to the Rajput resistance by the herald of Rajput lore, Todd, in the annals of antiquities. After the fall of Delhi, Shihabuddin advances on Kannauj, and Jayachand is slain at Chandawar near Etawah. During this encounter, his body identified by a bit of gold thread by which his teeth were fixed. This is a dentistry from Benares. His head was supposedly hoisted on a petard and brought to victorious Sultan. Legend, at least in the Jain sources, has it otherwise, suggesting that he was thrust with a dagger during the war and tossed into the torrents of the river Yamuna from the back of an elephant. His oldest son died in battle, and his older wife committed suicide. His younger wife and child submitted to Shihabuddin, and the Turkish army finally entered Varanasi. Todd typically does not divulge his sources, but writes that the king drowned in the Ganges, quote, a traitor to his nation, paying the price for having plotted against Prithviraj and his clan, nursing an old family vendetta. The price of defeat was unimaginable. After Varanasi fell to the Turks, there were, quote, scenes of devastation, plunder, and massacre that lasted through the ages. Laments Todd, quote, and all that was sacred in religion and celebrated in art was destroyed by these ruthless and barbarous invaders. So, if you read the story of Spolia with Todd in the background, it paints a very convincing picture and takes us away from earlier instances in Indian history of similar things. British colonial officers such as Todd were quick to level the charge of intolerance and ruthless iconoclasm at the new regime in power in the valley of the two sacred rivers. The evidence seems ready at hand, especially in the latter era Persian accounts that dutifully record the work of the destruction of temples and idols. Hasan Nizami, the history of the Ghurid general Qutbuddin Aibak, states that during the siege of Varanasi, nearly 1,000 temples were razed to the ground, zamindus, crushed into the ground, and mosques raised on their sites, and the new dispensation of Islamic faith, Islamic law were established. Ibn Asir, Kamil al-Tawarik, the quintessence of histories, notes that the booty that fell to the conquering army was laden on the backs of 1,400 camels. This number is reported as 4,000 by Muhammad Qasim Farishta, and similar lists of conquest and pillage at Gwalior, Malwa, Kalinjar, Multan, Sialkot, Ajmer, Sarasti, Meerut, Delhi, Bihar, Lucknowti, Banaras, and Badam adorn the pages of the standard historical compendium of the era, the Tabaqati Nasiri. And Tabaqati Nasiri is then copied in that part by Ziauddin Barani in the Tarikh-e Firozshah. Now these rounded figures are wildly erratic, I found out. They may well have been conventional tropes, prescribed perhaps sets of numbers. Nizami says clearly on this point that each and every campaign against infidels must be recorded by historians, and the story of the Sultan's deeds circulated far and wide. There was a clear precedent in the use of set figures, emulated from standard classics such as Al-Tabari's account of the major battles during the Islamic conquest of Persia. Such made-up numbers should not surprise us. Customary figures were also standard fare in European histories as late as the 18th century. As F.P. Locke has suggested, Edward Gibbon showed considerable mastery in such rhetorical use of numerals. Suffice it to say, we use it in Hindi and Urdu, Saikaro. What does it really mean? A lot. Yes, lots of things were destroyed. Suffice it to say that while the court panegyrists of the likes of Harsha's Bana, Pulakeshin's Ravikirti, or Harisena Samudragupta employed elaborate devices of literary allusion and ornamentation in exaggerating the deeds and feats of kings, the great chroniclers writing in Persian employed their own unique flourishes to elevate their patrons and the significance of their acts. One of the birudas of Samudragupta is Kritanta Parashu, the axe of Yama, the Lord of Death. It's a pretty fearsome epithet. It is difficult to believe, therefore, that the Turkish advance ended overnight. The patronage of Hindu temples or extant forms of pilgrimage and worship. In my book, I've spent a lot of time detailing the new temples that came out during the Sultanate period and the reclamation of many of the new ghats. And this is the patronage of lots of Rajput Thakurs and those, who were sometimes worked for the Sultan, sometimes they worked against them. The picture is complicated. Conspicuous desecration of temples and idols were aspects of prescribed Islamic orthodoxy as well as routine aspects of plunder. Only recently have historians of architecture have begun to salvage the complex history of spoliation from the dusty annals of colonial and early nationalist history. James Ferguson, the doyen of architectural historians in 19th century colonial India, insisted on certain rules of thumb separating elements of the Hindu from what he called the Saracenic style. In the early mosques, he notes, the Muslim rule, quote, appropriated the remains of Jain architecture to save themselves the trouble of erecting the whole building from original materials. Vexed by the resulting jumble of what appeared as historically and artistically incompatible, Ferguson searched for the exact seams in the architecture where these mutually incompatible forms of Muslim and Hindu building can be seen as joined. Looking at the Jami Masjid at Kannauj, converted from the Hindu temple by Ibrahim Shah of Jaunpur, and I don't have a picture of that, I don't think, in the early 15th century, Ferguson wrote that this was, quote, undoubtedly a Jain temple rearranged on a plan similar to a mosque in Cairo. The roof and the dome were pure examples of Jain architecture, so that, quote, no trace of the Moorish style is seen internally. But the exterior was purely Mohammedan architecture. So the Mohammedan architectural form had engulfed and appropriated an older temple within it. Similarly, the Great Qutb Minar, near the roof and the less visible areas he noted, were fragments of cross-legged figures belonging to the Jain sects, which he called the Hindu remains. Hybrid architecture thus becomes the indisputable outward proof of Islamic conquest and Hindu adversity, and more interestingly, Hindu weakness in the face of the Islamic onslaught, which is not at all true if you study the history. I'm almost there. Got another 5-10 minutes?
Go ahead.
Yeah. The history of the assimilation of Islam into the folds of local and regional communities in India, especially extended across the plains of the Ganga or the Ganges, begs a serious re-examination of the subcontinent's embattled past, which has been subject of such acrimony and such dispute in the fields of history and contemporary Indian politics. Military conquest, iconoclasm, selective appropriation of architectural space are all parts of a long unfolding cultural and social story. Contentious as it may be, the selective use and reuse of buildings and building materials from Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist antiquity is an essential part of this history, just as the appropriation of Rome and Roman antiquities were key to the making of Carolingian and post-Carolingian Renaissance monuments in Europe. They bear witness to the role of architecture in absorbing bits and pieces of the material past, which, as Maria Hansen has pointed out, are essential elements of all forms of architectural spolia. In this regard, structures like the Ark of Constantine in Rome and its layers of recycled fragments of previous reliefs pose a fundamental challenge. The plinths, pillars, and ornaments used in the conquest mosques of the Ghurids and Sultanate periods are both prizes and relics, but they are also solemn acknowledgements of previous regimes, bridging the recent past of Islam and the receding pasts of various previous pre-Islamic regimes. Iconoclasm, which includes the work of destruction, decapitation, defacement, or redefinition of images, has always been a difficult, daunting, and unending task, which could never be finished. This is what Barani says, that you cannot be good Muslims in this God-forsaken Hindu country. Richard Eaton, who has written extensively on the subject, points out that the desecration of temples should also be considered political acts calculated to supersede the authority of former rulers, just as you issue new coins. So Qutbuddin Aibak demolished temples in Kannauj and Varanasi. Next successor Iltutmish destroyed a 300-year-old temple in Malwa, and most notably the great temple of Mahakal in Ujjain, transporting the main deity and a statue of the legendary king Vikramaditya, Raja Bikramjit, the founder of the Hindu solar calendar, to the gates of his congregational mosque in Delhi to be trampled underfoot by visitors. Clearly, these kinds of intended desecration and instilling the fear of that act also happen. The inscription found in the inner lintel of the eastern gateway of the Qutb Mosque in Delhi notes that material from 27 temples, Bist wa Haft Alat-e Budkhane, was used for the structure that was endowed by Aibak. The Qutub complex and the Jami Masjid in Delhi were completed in two phases, 1191 to 1212 by Aibak, followed by his slave and successor Iltutmish or Altamash from 1229 to 1230. One big year with stones, pillars, and carvings from plundered temples. The imposing structure with its lofty 240-foot high tower made out of reddish sandstone, capped by white marble, has long been seen as synonymous with the absolute power, the Quwwat al-Islam Masjid, right, structure of Delhi Sultans and their efforts to erect a memorial to the triumph of the religion. This framework of interpretation has been challenged by historians such as my good friend Sunil Kumar, who points out that we know very little about the history of such construction, but the creative freedom with which native artisans, mostly Hindu, I'm assuming, incorporated the fragments of old temples into the new structure, and the fact that along with Turkish chieftains, subordinate Hindu Rauts and Thakurs took part in expeditions targeting other rival Thakurs should warn us against viewing such rebuilding activities simply as acts inspired by aversion to the idol worship of Hindu subjects. The new Islamic regime, despite its want of a pious and unyielding authority, was, as Kumar puts it, part of the, quote, complex, fragmented political and religious world of 12th century India. Pillars and defaced sculptures reused in Qutub Mosque not only reproduce Kirtimukha faces from which flowers and creepers emanate, and this is quite fascinating for me, they also have these kinds of pillars suggestive of the original Makara Torana. Makara Torana was just the gateways of going back to Gupta era temples where Ganges and Yamuna were the two deities on the entranceway. And the Makara, as you know, is the aquatic mascot of Ganga, you know, that composite dolphin. And so the Makara Torana would be like this on two sides. These are sort of the Kalpalata and the wave motif. And this is, in my estimation, a Makara Torana, which is part of the Qutub Minar. We just don't get to see the Ganga and Yamuna anymore. But anybody who knew this architecture entering the Qutub complex would know that this is a Makara Torana. So what does that mean in that context? What are they entering? So bits of sculpture that once belonged to the images of the river Ganga and Yamuna. Now, similar to Ghorid structures in Rajputana, Zafar Khan's, I want to show you the Kirtimukha, which is also, this is something that, you know, is the evil eye motif in many ways. This is the Kirtimukha in the Qutub Minar with the inverted lotus, which is very much use. I have seen such Kirtimukhas even in the columns in Sarnath. If you ever go to Sarnath in the deer park where the Buddha and the Dhammika Stupa, you can see Kirtimukhas like that. These are basically sort of, goes back to Yaksha figures, right? The plants coming out of the mouths and navels of very powerful sort of guardian deities. And the last thing I want to show, I want to just draw attention, this is something that I have been working on. I have a paper, you're welcome to take a look at it. I went back to supposedly the only standing mosques from that era, but perhaps one of the first mosques built in Bengal in Tributary, and the confluence of the three rivers. One of them is the Ganga, and this is Zafar Khan Ghazi's mosque. And here you can also see, and I don't have time to go into it, it's a similar, I look at the work of Blochman especially, and then Cunningham also, how they sort of talked about how this mosque was actually a Vishnu temple. Actually, Rakhaldas Bandapadhyay, the digger of Mohenjo-daro, then comes along and says it's actually a Surya temple, and it's got similarly sort of reassembled pillars with similar motifs of Kalpalata. And then this is the plinth. This is one of my photographs. You can see the basalt plinth of the old temple and the red stone of the mosque. And Zafar Khan Ghazi is a very emblematic figure because he then becomes he starts to attack Hindu kings, try to establish Islam, but later in life he becomes a Sufi pir, and then he learns Sanskrit and actually writes one of the greatest Sanskrit odes to the Ganga. So he's one of my figures in the Ganga book. if you ever get a chance, the odes that start with Janhavi Muni Kanya is fascinating, you know. So I'm going to leave it at that for now. I can talk more about this later if you're interested. One of the things about this particular structure is say that it turns out that not only is this structure has, you know, fragments of temples that cannot be traced, older temples which probably stood in ruins at the time, but it also has Arabic inscriptions and parts of older mosques that were also in ruins. So then you can think of the structure as a kind of a appropriation of kind of a museum, I guess, in some ways, where pasts and fragments of older regimes, both Islamic and pre-Islamic, are displayed. Of course, now it belongs to the Indian Archaeological Survey. I do not have a neat concluding story in what I've just discussed. I would just say that the practice of Indian history today is still built on certain politics of disambiguation. In other words, a simpler explanation is sought. It must always and dutifully make it clear the instances of invasive intrusions, recapitulating a history of violence, desecration, display, and misappropriation. The question is, where do we draw the line? Did the Cholans misappropriate Indian history by crossing over to the north, to the Vindhyas? I would beg to submit that such a recapitulation also reenacts a deeply ingrained instance of colonial reckoning, the discoveries of Cunningham and Ferguson, embellished by interlocutors such as Todd, that stage a singular and transformative moment of an Islamic invasion in India, and the rise of regimes that usurped the rightful belongings of Indian history from its original setting. How and why this form of historical rupture and the temporal reckoning that it engenders persist to the 70 plus years of post-independence in India and the history of the present-day Indian nation state is a discussion for another day. Why indeed does the story of Hindu defeat and weakness and the power and triumph of Islam dictate the history of Spolia so much more in some ways than the history of East India Company's, the British Empire's attempts to command the pasts of their Indian subjects through looting, collections, surveys, and museums in India and in England? Perhaps a more attentive history of Spolia might show us a more expansive way forward, I hope, to think of how these regimes, both pre-Islamic and Islamic, harsh or not harsh, clever or crude, themselves sought to confront and exorcise their own pasts as we are often driven to in our own museums and our own classrooms. Thank you. So I guess a little bit different from the book.
So we have time for questions.
Sorry, I just missed the name of the troop. We just go back a couple of slides.
Sure. Yeah.
Missed that slide.
The ones from the Zafar Khan Ghazi? Yeah.
Where is this?
This is in Tribeni in West Bengal. You have to travel, it's about an hour's drive, hour and a half, in north of Calcutta on the Hooghly, which is the Ganges. And there's a fascinating story about that. It's actually in Bengali legend is known as Darab Gaji. Darab Gaji turns out to be Zafar Khan Ghazi. And for a long time, people recited the Sanskrit poetry of Darab Khan without realizing that it's the same Zafar Khan who supposedly was an Islamic jihadi in his time. I have written an extensive piece on this in Asian ethnology, if you're interested, with all these pictures, called Betwixt Hindus and Muslims. It turns out that there's more than one Zafar Khan. It's like a detective story. It's hard to figure out which one they're talking about, but it's fascinating to me. Yes.
So I'm still a little confused. So why would you take let's say, Congress, say, why would you take a Hindu temple and, I don't know, chop off some of it and then turn it into a mosque? Why would you want to do that if you want to promote your religion?
Well, I mean, the way you would take over.
I mean, why not just build something next door and destroy the old temple?
That's right. The incorporation is very much part of the story here. You see similar things all over the world, right? It's not just India. I mean, this is where rebuilding happens, incorporation happens, motifs are taken, pillars are recycled. I mean, this is the recirculation of architectural pasts is a world historical phenomenon, not just India. So that's number one. But number two is that if you look carefully, these conquest, quote unquote, structures are very much also part of new structures, side by side with new structures. So, they're like the huge new, like the Adina Mosque much later, of course, there are new mosques, mostly Friday mosques that come up in, let's say, I'll give you Bengal, I know very well, Gaur Pandua, there's so many Friday mosques, congregational space where you want to draw in people. Remember, you're surrounded by people who are not part of your faith, and you want to popularize your faith. But and the point that I was trying to make with this tomb is that what are fragments of older mosques doing there either, right? What kind of spolia is that, In fact, most of the Arabic inscriptions inside were taken from mosques that no longer stand, so. But that's dodging the question. The question is that, when we see that one on top of the other, there's a particular emotional response that we have. The response is usurpation or spoliation, like rubbing something in, like your structure, your house has been vandalized and a new house has been put on top. That is the way we have been taught to think about it. So your response is every school child's response, right? But can we go beyond that?
I'm very interested in your example of the case in which bits of previous mosques were used. Now, I have a question: is that widespread, that kind of thing, or is there just one or two examples? Because if it's widespread, it suggests that possibly there was just a need for say, stone and building materials.
Absolutely.
And you just cobble together without thinking fancy thoughts about this or that. You would just cobble together any debris that you could find conveniently. But is that a widespread situation, or is it unusual?
It's hard to tell. I mean, I have not seen. One of the things that I think was going on is that the mosque is a safe space for preservation of ruins and other ruins that need to be brought in there. I mean, it was going on all the time. Somebody saying that in the village, like, we found this tablet. What would we do with it? Let's bring it to the old mosque and keep it there. It'll be under safekeeping. That's one way to think about it. But you're right. I mean, oftentimes it's also an economic necessity to quarry new stone. And who is Emperor Ashoka who could do that? I mean, Ashoka dug up every stupa in India, apparently, and redistributed the remains of the Buddha according to the new dictates of the landscape of Dhamma. Talk about spolia. That is real power. Yes.
I think both things undoubtedly happened. I mean, there was clearly an appropriation of material, and that was symbolic and powerful.
Sure.
And you were taking away the religious and political power from the monuments you subjugated and so on. You incorporate those into your own structures. That's widespread and well known. There are also instances, I can think of two offhand, where building materials were simply recycled for convenience. At Amaravati, we have early phase Amaravati, 1st century BC, later phase around 2nd AD. Slabs worked on both sides, one in the first phase, one in the second. That's simply a reappropriation within the same religious context, convenience. And then you get a Gaur in Bengal, Gaur, for example, where we have an instance, there's a slab in the British Museum which has a Brahmanical subject on one side and was clearly removed recycled from a Hindu temple complex and reworked on the other side with hanging lamp decoration, classic Islamic decor to be incorporated into a mosque interior or exterior.
In fact, the hanging lamp decoration
both things happen.
from the Surah Nur, the lamp, that motive is so common in Bengal, and it exists along with the lotus. I'm thinking about the Adina Mosque here.
Well, one thing I could mention, which hasn't been touched on, is the appropriation of Buddhist material by Hindus.
Yes.
And this is less well recognized and less well documented, perhaps. But we have one instance, many will be aware of the almost complete absence of survival of early and medieval bronzes, Buddha image bronzes coming down into the modern time, and they all disappeared in the course of the 13th and later centuries, mostly undoubtedly melted down for them, the value of their materials. But there's an instance came to light fairly recently of a 1 meter high Buddha image, which survived in India into the 20th century, as best we can tell, and clearly not in a Buddhist context. Survival could only have happened by virtue of the fact that it was under worship in a non-Buddhist setting. The object is non-archaeological, it's never spent time in the ground, scientists could demonstrate this, and so the most likely explanation is that the object survived by being appropriated and rededicated and worshipped as an image of Vishnu. And this is the...
In fact, I just wanted to add that this structure, actually, if you look at Rakhal Das's description, what he saw, and these have not survived, that underneath the Vishnu temple, he also found Buddhas with a Bhumisparsha mudra, and also found Jain, Tirthankaras. So, who knows? I mean, this is the antiquity, the layered antiquity of that site, where it could have very well been both a Jain and Buddhist complex, and then the Surya temple was built as the expression of power of a particular dynasty, and then so you layer it up. By the way, in Bengal, there's a particular form of Shiva called Shiva Nankateshwara, the naked Shiva, is nothing but Parshvanathan, so.
But here, actually, this is something that interested me a lot, this layering effect that you're speaking about. Now, you're speaking about it in terms of these material substances.
Right.
But I'm interested in the ways that these, that this layering also begins to affect the way that, beliefs are being practiced.
Absolutely.
Did you mention, was it Zabur Khan? No, it was the other one, the other image. The one with the Vishnu plinth. You talked about him.
That's the same. It's the same temple.
Was it the same that he's drawn to Sufi?
Yes, same person. Yeah.
So that's actually something that I would like to hear you say more about, the way in which this architectural melding actually begins to reshape the content of beliefs.
I would love to talk more about this. I mean, the two things are fascinating here. One is that along with the old reclaimed mosque, there's also a Dargah of Zafar Khan, which is right next to it, which is the mazar and where the urs happens, right? You can go and listen to the music. And where is it? It is on one of the holiest Hindu pilgrimage spots, commanding the river right there. So the whole story is the Hindu pilgrims come for their solstice bathing, etc., come down, visit the mosque, and go inside and get their shirni and their blessings, if there's a urs, or if not, just go and get their, see, it's like equal opportunity. If you want to be blessed, you go for whatever will make your son pass your exam, his exam, So you go to do all the things. So that's a more popular account of this. But you're right, Gauri. I mean, I think that what you're actually alluding to is something a little bit harder to talk about, which is to say, how do our historical practices sometimes follow a certain kind of seriatim pattern of layering in architecture, right? It's sort of ingrained into the way we think about historical period and epoch. Like almost like chapters, right? With a certain kind of forward progress. That is the way the DNA of historical time is put together, right? And it has a very deep effect. A certain kind of historical temporalities are very dear to our thinking, very close to our thinking about how the past is. And it's hard to liberate. I mean, I can't necessarily do it. I teach this history and I realize that it is a particular telling that we have, with maps and chronologies, right? Sorry, yes.
I just wanted to follow up.
Yeah, sure.
Just two personal anecdotes. When I went to Bodh Gaya, and the whole area was recovered, I think, in the 30s from under riverbed, and there were multiple, whatever little temple-like things. And our guide told us that in fact I think one or two of them are supposed to be Hindu temples there. And he said just some idols were planted there after the place was recovered. And so subsequently, even though it is run by an international board, foreigners can't easily tell people in India, no, these idols don't belong. This entire thing is a Buddhist thing. They aren't able to do that. So the official statement there is that this is a Buddhist thing, but with a couple of temples, supposedly Hindu temples. So that is, to me, just appropriation in the modern era. And just one more thing, when I went to a Kanchipuram temple near my hometown, I was told by a friend who was not in the book that in fact there were Jain, little structures, remaining inside the temple compound. So this appropriation goes on.
Of course. No, I mean, it's really how we look at this as a usurpation or a continuum. That's the thing that. Yes, sir.
Thank you for the talk. I've learned a great deal, and I appreciate the longer history you're giving of the complexity of destruction, spoilage, and then reuse.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could say something about the other end of the timeline. Is there a moment you can identify when identities, sensibilities become so polarized that it's no longer possible to do this kind of destruction and repurposing? Is it in the 18th or 19th century? Is it into the 20th century where to now destroy a mandir or to repurpose a mosque becomes such a kind of heightened political issue?
Because they're supercharged with history and significance, right?
And I think of that because in Toronto, in Canada, you have these instances of every once in a while, an old church can turn into a loft and an apartment buildings for yuppies. And earlier times, there's a lot of gurdwara that were churches, and they were presumably purchased when the congregation moved out, and it's no real issue. So I wonder when it becomes an issue. The other question, just a side one, for the book, could you tell us why you went with Ganges and not Ganga? If it was a publisher thing, was there a fight behind it?
There was a fight. There was a fight. I lost the fight here, and I won the fight in India.
Okay.
Sorry.
Just for the audience, the American audience?
Basically, the press said that it's too close to the surge ganja. I mean, I'm so serious. That was I was told. So the original book is called Ganga, the many paths of an Indian river.
Yeah.
The Indian version is called Ganga, the many paths of a river. So, but the Ganges, the word is as old as the word India. So if you use India, the Greeks, right? So if you want to use India, I would say I can use the word Ganges. If you say something else, I'll use something. So quid pro quo. But thank you. Yes.
Yes, hi. I've crossed many rivers to come and hear you. I'm back in Brooklyn, but
I'm very happy.
I think your
grateful.
book is doing something really exciting, and I know there's a lot of very exciting work on rivers being done in India, but I think the way you are writing about the Ganga and your sort of deep ecology of the river, and the way you sort of pull it out in your book in this exquisite way. Could you talk more about that deeper sedimentation through which you tease out the book in its different tributaries and its different shifts out this incredible river? And I guess I'm asking you this question. Do you see a distinctive ontology of the Ganga that's different from, say, from the Periyar, which is the river I'm looking at? Different kinds of sedimentations, different kinds of...
I think sedimentation is a very good word in every sense, I mean, with the, when you see the Gangavatarana sculpture of the Pallavas, right? Then you're right next to the Pala River, you're supposed to think that this could be too, So when the Cholas came and they released the waters of the Ganga into the Kaveri, they said that they had the transubstantiation of aquatic content, happens all the time. But I think that will take another conversation to talk about the way, in which the ecological and the sacred are related, which is part of what I've explored in the book. In this case, I think I got I'm a little bit too much into spolia, which I think could be a fetish, by the way. I'm going with a particular thing here. But one of the things that I really want to talk about is that it's not so much the power and the appropriation or the misappropriation of past objects and buildings. It's really also about sacred space, right? Where is Akbar's biggest structure? The biggest fort in terms of actual size, square footage. It's not the Naulakha fort in Lahore. It is not even the Agra fort. Fatehpur Sikri in many ways is exquisite, but not of that magnitude. It is the Allahabad fort. And what does Akbar do, right? He says that, okay, there are people committing suicide from the, jumping into the well, right? There was a well there from the banyan tree where people used to commit ritual suicide. Committing ritual suicide was a very common thing. Akbar didn't like it. He loved the idea of Allahabad, so he said Ilahi from the Islamic mystical side, and then of course Abbas, Sanskrit, abode. This is where he was, it used to be just the villages of Kara and Manikpur, a forest full of wild elephants. And he finds that place there, right? And he says, no, this is Prayag, this is the old confluence. Here's the city around it, and he builds the fort and puts the Akshay Vata, the great banyan tree, the great holy banyan tree from where people used to jump down, inside the fort. So now you can't do it anymore. But if you want, as a good Hindu subject of Akbar's Mughal Empire, right, you have to go through the fort to Patal Puri, which is now the new name of the temple, all the way down to pay obeisance to the great banyan tree. So this is not just a devout move. This is a political move, if you think about it, right? This is something that is, and of course Akbar also believed that he was the reincarnation of Mukunda Brahmachari. I don't know whether you've come to that part of the book. Yeah, he used to recite this Sakala Vratahari Brahmachari Mukunda shloka all the time. And I was obsessed with the idea that, anyway, I will not divulge that little story, but, so there are so many other things going on here, but the idea of sacred space, which is also powerful, right, is something that is, how does sacred territory, sacred space become political territory? How does it become political capital, right, is something that I'm very interested in exploring. Because there won't be any power to that kind of appropriation if that space had no meaning. Do you see what I'm saying? Like the way the Cholas, when they invaded Sri Lanka, right? The way they sacked Anuradhapura, right? And the kind of things that happened in that sack, and the kind of images that were taken, etc. Tell you something about their obsession with that particular site, one of the largest, right, Buddhist collections of texts, complexes, etc. I mean, all the Sinhala texts of the Chulavamsa, Mahavamsa all come from Anuradhapura, So, yes.
Just a brief question. How far south did Muslim rule go at its height in India? And was there any taking over, incorporation from the beautiful Hindu temples of South India for mosque building in that part of the country? Was this activity just concentrated in northern India?
No, there's plenty of store.
Was it widespread?
Wow, this is going to take a while. If you go further back, so south of the Vindhyas, if you start raiding into it, so the Tughlaq started raiding. So you have the great transfer of the capital to Daulatabad. So that fortress is Devagiri. That's the Yadavas. And the Yadavas had temples there, and it's part of that hillock, right? not a hillock, it's a huge hill, almost a mountain, right? And then you have all these other regimes like the Bahmani, who had a relationship with the Vijayanagara kingdom is something which came out of the conflict where the Harihara and Bukka reclaimed their Hindu status, right? After having been converted. And the this is, Richard Davis has written about it, many others have, the Vijayanagara kingdom indulges in spolia. The Rajputs do too, by the way. Uday Singh's, the Rana Uday Singh's family, the Kirti Stambhas, are kind of mimic in some ways the Qutub Minar, like the victory standard of the Rajputs. The Jaya Stambhas, Kirti Stambhas, they're there too. There's a lot of like back and forth going on. I don't want to get into the larger history. I'm simply interested in this case on how the Gangetic heartland as a sacred space become a site for this fight unfolding over claim of territory, and this claim of territory is expressed often through the appropriation of structures. That is really the smaller story that I'm trying to focus on. But these are all questions that I think lots of art historians and architecture historians would know much better than me. Yes.
Thank you for that. Really quite a fascinating talk. I have a question actually about terminology.
Speak up a bit, please.
So I have a question about terminology.
Sure.
I want to think with you about the word spoiler, which, as you note, is obviously very well endowed with historiography, historians, etc.
And have their particular etymological and historical origins. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I wonder, what is the relationship of spatiality to spoiler? So you have two examples, the one you mentioned in particular, the Roman examples, and one you mentioned in passing, which is the East India Company. Now in both of these cases, space itself, right, the figural or figurative transfer happens across what we call discursively dissimilar spaces, right? So there is the battlefield and the capital, there's the conquered land and the kind of this periphery in the center that is happening. And even including Ghazni into the picture,
right,
is very much part of the Ashokan imagination and reality. Even including that into the picture, the travel of objects that happens within the, let's say, Hindustani period does not actually, I think, analytically map onto the spoila as far as the Roman or the English example might be. Which goes also to the question that you're raising, which is the renegotiation of sacred space. So it's in many ways the capacity of a sacred object, even deconstructed, remains tied to a very kind of remains tied to a natal sense of spatiality. So how do we kind of think about that relationship between space and a deconstructed object within Hindustan, as opposed to the historiography or the analytical historiography, which, if you take from the Roman or the English examples, actually takes us to a paradigm of conquest, foreign, local, that is one of the legacies that we inherit, right? So
I think that the question you're asking can also be asked of the Roman case, which is to say, you're talking about what is the geographical redistribution and the ultimate dispersal of these objects through redistribution of these objects in a different imperial space, and that happens as the Roman Empire changes too, right? It's a good place. I mean, it's a good point to enter into the idea of the different kinds of geographical imaginaries, right? Political imaginaries, where one would have to distinguish a little bit between the idea of a political place and political space, older distinction in spatial theory, right? You're too fun. But more than that, the idea of a particular kind of intimate mnemonic of almost the aesthetic of a particular place and its emotional appeal, etc., and something much larger. So one of the things that I'm looking at down the road is actually the British reappropriation of Murshidabad, and then the objects and artifacts of the palace, etc., etc. It's kind of inventories of their contract. Literally using a particular kind of a Nawabi establishment as collateral. So I've worked in the Murshidabad archive, and going back there at some point, I want to look at the Nizamat lists of things that the British create. The British create amazing lists of objects, like from kind of like toothbrushes to spittoons to, like, because it's part of that inventory. And then these things then become part of private collections. They become part of, company collections. Some go to England, ultimately end up in museums. So, yes, I mean, I think that there are both significant continuities, as the new Romans that they themselves call themselves, but also there's great discontinuities, because this kind of geographical imaginary works in tandem with James Reynolds' map of the Gangetic Valley, of strategic locations, etc. So it's a very good question. It brings back the question of the claim of space and non-cartographic and cartographic notions of territory. Subject for another maybe discussion. I did not go into that too much today because mine is more about place here in some ways rather than the notion of space. Yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to follow up on that question a little bit, maybe. If part of it was about kind of like the British East India Company picking up on the politics of patronage and preservation, in a kind of imposing themselves maybe as a kind of inheriting removal past, versus later ideas of like in situ preservation that the ASI did, which was kind of much more formal, not sacred at all. I'm thinking of like the debate over how to preserve like the Sanchi Gate and stuff like that. So that kind of, and that's also things about place. Like preservation could take various forms. It could be scribal, it could be, taking a photograph, but in conservation was very localized and also very, very much not about sacred.
Yes, the good question. It's actually a good example of the Sanchi Stupa. If you juxtapose that to the Bharut Stupa. So if you go to the Indian Museum today in Calcutta, you can go inside the Bharut Stupa. It's just one wing of the museum. So that has been recreated and sort of re-put together in this museum space, right? Which just goes back to the people who did it, like people like Cunningham. The British looked at all of India as a kind of a museum. I mean, in some ways, right? Like a
museum.
Yeah, so I have to be very careful when I say that preservation is also another kind of appropriation, right? And taking. I have to be careful because I would not like to see museums vandalized, right? That's a good word, vandalized. The Vandals, what did they do? They indulged in spoliation of the fragments of the Roman Empire. And what do? We call them Vandals. It's the name of a group. Right, so. Yes. But it's a good question,
Happy who has the Fritz's work is really, she does a lot of those.
Oh, yeah. She was actually my TA in studying in college. No, but the old friend, yeah, thank you. Yes, of course. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for your talk. And I haven't read your book, so the answer might be there, in which case you'd say, read my book. But it seems to me that you, at least in the talk, are concerned with sacred places and objects. Have you seen anything about secular objects and places? Like, what I mean is like public buildings, roads, trails, which do not have necessarily any sacred meaning, but it has a lot of public meaning. Have you seen anything about that?
Of course.
That kind of appropriation?
Of course.
Can you say a word about it?
The great Grand Trunk Road. I mean, the Grand Trunk Road with Sher Shah's great experiment was really about the lack of transportation and the hazards of public transportation during the monsoons, right? So remember, Humayun was defeated twice, right, because of logistics. And Sher Shah said, okay, I'm going to take the Royal Highway, the old Maurya Highway, and do a detour. I'm going to go through Chotanagpur, go through, Rohtas Fort, Chunar, Eastern UP down, and then up again, right? Sasaram. So if you have that kind of a thoroughfare, you begin to realize the vision of Shesha, which is very much in my book, which is the Chunar Fort itself, which by the way used to be a temple at some point. You can go and visit it. There are very intimate forms of space that are part of the story of the rise of two things. First, the rise of cities when Buddhism became the great trading religion, right? So there's a section in my book, I hope you get a chance to take a look at it, of how the different caravan trails crisscrossed and created this sort of amazing lattice of trails which defines Majjhima Desha, right? And all the relics and pilgrimages and the various votive stupas, etc., part of that landscape. And that's another kind of we don't call it spolia, but substance that travels, the Pancharatna and other tiny votive urns that people are carrying around, That's one. And then of course the rise of the agrarian heartland. I have a chapter called the making of the agrarian heartland, which is a hefty chapter, which is really the beginning of the beginning and the fulfillment of one of the largest peasant societies the world has ever seen, which is the Gangetic Valley, right? Which sustains the surplus of all the empires, and those are, and the secular and the sacred are not that far from each other. I start.
I understand.
Yeah, I start the book with Vishnu's emblem, which is the shalagram, right? So it's the ammonite. What is the ammonite? The ammonite is the mollusk fossil from the Sea of Tethys, and that is one of Vishnu's aquatic symbols. So the Greeks were fascinated with fossils, so were the Hindus. So the sacred and the secular are like this. But more to be said about that.
Jagdish?
If I remember correctly, when we were in southern Spain and in Cordoba, I think, the church, was inside the mosque. So it wasn't that it had been dismembered, like you were talking about and so on, for material and so on. Is that, do you get anything like that where you're superimposing your religion's,
look at look at this.
Do we have anything like that?
Look at the inside of the Jami Masjid, which is the old Atala temple. If I didn't tell you and you were blindfolded and you look around with the pillars, are you inside a mosque or a temple? But the Jaffrey will give it away possibly, because that lattice work comes later.
There was an ambiguity there, but in the other case there wasn't any ambiguity.
No, the best example of that, of course, is the Hagia Sophia, the Hagia Sophia, where the Turkish Tugras just hang in front.
What is the significance of doing it that way? Does that mean that you
even more sophisticated appropriation? No, it's
a way of simply say you're inferior.
No,
right?
but
we encompass you, right? So while it appears like you're very,
but also I'm
in fact you're reducing it to an inferior status as a religion.
It can be seen as that. It also be, I
was just curious.
No. I mean, Kitab al-Hind, Al-Biruni says, who will preserve the lost knowledges of the Brahmins if we don't do it? I know, and in the beginning for his patron, he says, Hinduism has been destroyed, which is, you realize, is complete BS, because he's talking to Hindus all the time. But once you get into the book, you see this is what he's talking about, that we have inherited this ancient civilization, which is no longer as good as it used to be. It's upon us to, etc. So there's that vaunt too, which is part of power. Power is not just all about breaking your little house. It's also about appropriating your best
in different ways
and civilizational. This is what the British were doing, weren't they? They were saying that until we come to Macaulay. But of course, I should be careful about putting all of these different instances into one comparable framework. Yes.
Yeah, but this is where I am a little puzzled, because you were referring earlier on to history books, and students feel they feel shocked, they feel angry when they see appropriation.
As I did.
And you gave your own example.
Yeah.
And it's that affect aspect that I find really striking, that,
Yes.
I think partly what Jagdish is asking is also about, is it possible to just speak about coexistence of different architectural forms that signify
Right.
different religions in the very abstract sense?
Sure.
Because clearly it doesn't, it creates an affect, and that's really the troublesome matter.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely the key, which is that we cannot, in some ways, you cannot simply present a neutral case of historical succession, right? Which is not what I'm trying to do. I'm just showing you that there are other ways of thinking about it, but not belittling what you're just saying. We just say, but can we work through it? That's the question. Can we work through it? I mean, it's okay to feel offended or to feel, to look at the misdeeds or the tragedies of history. When I think about Mahakala temple being dismantled, where Kalidasa used to supposedly pray, right? That's something significant, that was torn down in a certain time in Indian history, right? But the next step is it a quid pro quo? So when they destroyed the Babri Masjid, how many people who were destroying actually bothered to look up that it was not built by Babur? Babur happened to just pray there. It was an older structure. It just took up that name, right? But it becomes such a symbol, which is, if you talk to people on the streets, they will say, you're mad. Well, of course there was Baburs, et cetera, right? So that's where, the dialogue starts shrinking, right? And we don't have that space. I'm talking about opening up the space of disagreement and opening up the space of dialogue and maybe even conflict of a different kind. The kind of struggle that is going on today over monuments is the breakdown of dialogue and breakdown of discussion. It's simply like, you or me, then it becomes, that's a different kind of historical erasure. So, but without that sting, why did Aurangzeb destroy the Gyanvapi cistern and a couple of the great temple, the old Vishveshwar? He says, because Shivaji secretly sent puja to these temples when he was fleeing. I had to punish those temples. And I made the Hindus of Benares see what their broken down temple looks like. So the sting of that order is felt. And this is Aurangzeb's own, cruelty in some ways, right? On the other hand, Aurangzeb's early Benares grant is, no, please do not disturb the Brahmin establishments and old established temples. It's two sides of that power. Good. I agree with you. I don't want to lose the sight of that part. But the question is that whose hurt is it? Like, what is this?
Yeah, but there is a kind of dialectical process here of moving from the abstraction of the relationship of the architecture.
I need to think about this more carefully.
To the affect, because it seems to me that it's impossible to extract that affective impact on one, especially in contemporary India.
Absolutely. You cannot disregard it by any means. No, you have to go through it. But what does that mean in terms of where is that emotional experience of what civilization is in some ways, right? How does that feature into our writing, and how do we write about it? Or how do we talk about it? And whose affect? What kind of affect theory would work for it? It's not like any other emotion. What kind of emotion is invoked in that particular space? I'm not sure I have the answer to that. That's a deeper philosophical question that I need to think about. This is just the beginning of something I'm thinking about. I'm not quite sure where I'm going to go with this.
Well, speaking about beginnings, I think perhaps we should end it now, as we are just a little over time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
As I said, it's a good gift for weddings and bar mitzvahs and.
Please join us for a reception next door.